for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla, the overall 21st installment of the Godzilla franchise, as well as the penultimate installment of the Heisei era of the Godzilla series. And because this movie came out in 1994, it was also created to celebrate the, at the time, 40th anniversary of the Godzilla franchise. But that's not the only reason why this movie was created, because sometime during the early 90s, there were talks that there was going to be the first ever American-produced Godzilla movie, which originally was supposed to come out in 1994. However, there were some production troubles with the first American-produced Godzilla movie, resulting in its production getting delayed, meaning the movie wouldn't be released until 1998, but that's a story for another time, meaning that the producers over at Toho Studios had to produce further Godzilla movies in order to keep the brand going, even though the producers at the time stated that Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, that came out in 1993, was originally supposed to be the final installment of the Heisei era, but here we are talking about Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla. And as far as the production of the movie is concerned, much like any other installment of the Heisei era, the producers went through several different ideas, with the first draft being Godzilla vs. Emperor Ghidorah, in which would have had Godzilla battling a new Ghidorah, but unlike the one he fought in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, that was more of a man-made creation, this Emperor Ghidorah was more like the original incarnation of King Ghidorah from the Showa series, in which it would have been an alien that came from the deep depths of space. And if you're sitting there wondering, wait a minute, I'm having this sense of deja vu. You be correct, because remember, if you paid attention to my review of Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth, one of the first ideas for the immediate follow-up to 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was called The Return of King Ghidorah, which would have had Godzilla fight a new King Ghidorah that came from outer space. Not sure how true this information is, but apparently this was the first draft, and the reason why it was scrapped had to do with the fact that in the same year, Toho Studios was also producing Yamato Takeru, whose primary antagonist was that of Orochi, the eight-headed dragon, who also would have came from space. And as a result, Godzilla vs. Emperor Ghidorah would end up being rejected due to Orochi being so similar to Emperor Ghidorah. Again, not sure how true this information is, but that's apparently how the story went. And I'll also bring up Yamato Takeru again in a few minutes, but for the second script idea, if you recall the unused monster Bagan from my review of Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth, during that movie's production, there was originally supposed to be a Godzilla vs. Bagan movie within the production of Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth, but that idea got scrapped in favor of, well, Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth. So technically this Godzilla vs. Bagan script is the second draft to feature the Bagan monster, and as for the plot to this particular draft, it would have revolved around Godzilla, Mothra, and another Rodan joining forces to battle a demonic creature called Bagan that proved to be so powerful that not even the combined forces of Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan were enough to stop it, forcing Godzilla to absorb so much radiation that he turns into a more powerful form called Super Godzilla to match Bagan. And this draft of the Godzilla vs. Bagan script was heavily inspired by the Super Nintendo game Super Godzilla that was released in December 23rd of 1993. But for some reason, this draft of the movie got canned for unknown reasons. This eventually led into the next draft of the script, Godzilla vs. Astro Godzilla. And this is where Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla was starting to take form around this time period. Because in this Astro Godzilla draft, the story goes that a space monster dubbed Astro Godzilla was created from the cells of Biollante and came to Earth to conquer it. And upon arriving, the Astro Godzilla psychically manipulates both Miki Segusa along with Little Godzilla, forcing it to do its bidding. This captures the attention of Godzilla, who comes to Japan to rescue his mind-controlled son, resulting in Godzilla teaming up with the new G-Force weapon MOGERA and Mothra to not only free Little Godzilla, but to also put an end to Astro Godzilla's reign of terror once and for all. In the description Astro Godzilla was given as far as what he would have looked like, supposedly he would have been albino, have a huge set of wings, twin tails, and unlike Godzilla, who just gained his spiral fire ray, Godzilla had more of an ice motif, to a point that he even had a ice beam, allowing it to freeze almost anything. But as time went on, Godzilla got heavily modified to a point where the ice motif would eventually be replaced with the idea of a crystal organism, eventually leading into Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla. And the reason why the Godzilla draft got heavily modified, well, if you remember a few minutes ago, I talked about a movie called Yamato Takeru, which was another big budgeted movie being produced by Toho Studios, but upon its theatrical release, it bombed at the box office. So Toho Studios decided to drastically reduce the budget to this movie, resulting in the Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla movie that we know today. And yes, I'm aware there's another Godzilla vs. Neo Godzilla or Crystal Godzilla draft in between Godzilla and Spacegodzilla, but there's really nothing of worth to add here. But anywho, as far as Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla is concerned, even though it's one of the Godzilla movies to be considered a milestone of the Godzilla franchise, given that it was meant to celebrate the, at the time, 40th anniversary of the Godzilla franchise, a lot of Godzilla fans universally don't like this movie, and myself included, to a point that many fans consider Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla to be not only the worst installment of the Heisei era, but one of the worst installments of the Godzilla franchise in general. Although, over time in recent years, I have noticed that the movie has gained a bit of a cult following. And one of the more notable members of this cult following happens to be the American movie director Tim Burton. That's right, the same guy who directed Edward Scissorhands stated that this was his favorite Godzilla movie, which begs the question, was Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla a good way to celebrate the, at the time, 40th anniversary of the Godzilla franchise? As for the plot of the movie, Miki Sugusa, along with several other members of the Japanese military, arrive at Birth Island in order to plant a mind control device on Godzilla. And while G-Force is currently building a new mech in the form of MOGERA to replace Super Mecha Godzilla for the sole purpose of destroying Godzilla once and for all, several new threats arrive in the form of both the Yakuza, along with a malevolent alien beast that vaguely looks like Godzilla, whose sole mission is to not only conquer Earth, but to also destroy Godzilla in the process. Can Godzilla and mankind put aside their differences long enough, or will the newly dubbed Space Godzilla succeed in his mission of killing Godzilla and conquering Earth for himself? In terms of what I liked about the movie, I like where the movie begins with G-Force in regards to how they plan to deal with Godzilla, because they have two different operations in mind, Operation M and Operation T. Operation M is basically them building another giant robot in the form of M.O.G.U.E.R.A to kill Godzilla, while Operation T focuses on Miki Sugusa along with a group of scientists and foot soldiers that implant a transmitter device onto Godzilla to mind control him. So I actually do like the fact that G-Force is trying to think outside of the box in terms of how to deal with Godzilla without resorting to tanks and jets, since we haven't really seen that kind of decision making since The Return of Godzilla from 1984, where the Japanese Prime Minister sees value in both using the Super X weapon to kill Godzilla or using Dr. Hayashida's seagull homing device to distract Godzilla away from the mainland and lure him to a nearby volcano. And I do like the fact that this movie's focused on G-Force again, since that was a major highlight of the previous movie. Sure, we're not dealing with the same cast of characters, but again, the fact that we're focused on yet another military operation that's created exclusively for the sole purpose of dealing with Godzilla, I think is always neat to see. And another aspect of this movie I really like is the character of Yuki, who is, in my opinion, the best written character of this entire movie, because if I had to compare Yuki, I put him in the same ballpark as Colonel Gondo from Godzilla vs. Biollante, where here's a man where, unlike all the other humans who dread facing Godzilla, he welcomes the challenge. Doesn't matter if he's piloting M.O.G.U.E.R.A or taking out Godzilla with a bazooka, he's up for the challenge. But whereas Colonel Gondo does it more for the fun of it, Yuki does it more for personal reasons, because the character arc he goes through is very significant within the franchise, because as of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, this is the first time a revenge plot is used for a character within the context of the entire franchise. Something that would continue in later installments. And of the many revenge plots against Godzilla that occur in some of the later installments, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla is the one that does it the best, for the simple reason that Yuki actually goes through a character arc, unlike some of the later movies that incorporate this character writing. And on top of that, I do like the fact that the movie establishes that Yuki has a personal connection to Colonel Gondo from Godzilla vs. Biollante. And knowing this information, I can see why Yuki is the way he is within the context of this movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the world building in regards to the relationship between G-Force and Godzilla as of this movie, because since the events of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, there does seem to be this understandable truths between G-Force, more specifically mankind and Godzilla, since Godzilla now has become a father figure, so he's taking care of his son, which means he's not attacking Japan as sporadically as he has done in the past several movies, showcasing that perhaps mankind can coexist with something like Godzilla, since we haven't really had that kind of interaction between mankind and giant monsters since the ending of Destroy All Monsters back in 1968. And the final thing I liked about the movie is Godzilla's titular opponent, Space Godzilla. Now sure, Space Godzilla conceptually is a very ridiculous idea in that sense where he's literally just Godzilla from outer space. And while I think his name, Space Godzilla, sounds kind of stupid, it at least makes sense within the context of the movie. Sure, I think Astro Godzilla personally sounds like a much cooler name for this type of character, but Space Godzilla fits the bill just fine, I suppose. But anywho, what do I actually like about Space Godzilla as Godzilla's opponent within the context of the movie? First off, it still continues that tradition that Godzilla has some kind of connection to his opponent within the context of the Heisei series, in that sense where Space Godzilla is literally just a cosmic clone of Godzilla from outer space, given that Space Godzilla's DNA shares a lot of DNA with the one from Earth. And up to this point in the Heisei franchise, Space Godzilla is truly the first evil monster we've seen within the context of the Heisei series, because between the Return of Godzilla up to Godzilla and Mothra Battle for Earth, Godzilla filled the role as the villain in those movies. Biollante was never evil to begin with. King Ghidorah, while technically bad, was only bad because he was under the influence of the Futurians. Mothra was never evil to begin with, while Batra, while antagonistic, was never evil to begin with. More of a anti-hero than anything else. Sure, Rodan had an antagonistic relationship with Godzilla, but he himself wasn't evil. And by the time he introduced Mechagodzilla, Mechagodzilla is not really evil neither, since Godzilla was more the anti-villain of that movie. But still, of all of the monsters that have appeared within the Heisei franchise between the Return of Godzilla up to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, there has been no monster that has been pure evil until the arrival of Space Godzilla within the context of this movie, because within the context of not just the Heisei franchise, but the entire franchise as a whole, Space Godzilla is the first legit villain to attack Godzilla emotionally by attacking his son. Sure, you had Gabra who attacked Minya in Godzilla's Revenge, but Gabra was more of a bully to Minya and was more of an antagonistic to Minya as opposed to Godzilla, whereas Space Godzilla, on the other hand, is a whole nother ball game, because he actually tries to go out of his way to kill little Godzilla to get back at Godzilla himself. And on top of that, Space Godzilla is also shown to be very intelligent, as he's shown to outsmart Godzilla and M.O.G.E.R.A on some occasions while he was fighting the two of them, either individually or together. And as far as the actual battles surrounding Space Godzilla are concerned, as of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, this is what most people refer to as the third and final installment of the Beam Wars trilogy, given that a lot of the monster battles consist of nothing but Godzilla and his opponents spamming laser beams at another. But with a monster such as Space Godzilla, I think having him beam spam makes the most sense in the context of the movie, given that the beam spamming plays with his power set, since he's more of a long-range fighter as opposed to a melee fighter. So the beam spamming actually makes sense within the context of the movie. I also love the world building surrounding Space Godzilla's connection to Godzilla in that sense, sense where Godzilla's very existence is so influential that even his DNA is dangerous to a point that it could tip the scale of power, not just on planet Earth, but in the universe itself, which is perhaps the most craziest aspect of Spacegodzilla that I like. And another aspect of Spacegodzilla that I really like is that this is the first brand new foe that Godzilla has fought in some time. Because with Godzilla vs. Biollante proving to be a box office disappointment because it had Godzilla battling a monster that was not one of the classic foes, Toho decided to bring back a lot of classic Godzilla enemies from King Ghidorah, Mothra, Rodan, and Mechagodzilla. So I do appreciate that Toho went out of their way to create a brand new monster for Godzilla to fight against, as opposed to reusing a pre-existing foe, such as Hedorah or Gigan. Sure, Spacegodzilla is nothing more than a cosmic clone of Godzilla, but I'll take it. Now, in terms of aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings on, let's start with the new giant robot, M.O.G.U.E.R.A, because M.O.G.U.E.R.A's appearance in this movie is kind of significant in that sense where, technically speaking, M.O.G.U.E.R.A first appeared in the 1957 science fiction movie, The Mysterians. And as of Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla, even though this is the character's second appearance in the movie, this is technically his first appearance in a Godzilla movie. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad Toho went with M.O.G.U.E.R.A over originally what they were supposed to have, because something I forgot to mention in my very lengthy intro, apparently one of the drafts to Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla was to feature yet another Mechagodzilla being built by G-Force, which would have resulted in Godzilla teaming up with Mechagodzilla to battle Spacegodzilla. And the reason why they decided to switch out Mechagodzilla with M.O.G.U.E.R.A of all things came down to the following possible reasons. Reason number one, there will have been one too many Godzilla-like characters within the same movie. And second, it wouldn't really make any sense because in the previous movie, Godzilla fought against Mechagodzilla, so why would Godzilla team up with something that tried to kill him in the previous movie to fight Spacegodzilla? Which is why M.O.G.U.E.R.A was brought into the picture, supposedly. But the reason why I actually like M.O.G.U.E.R.A in this movie, because as I mentioned with Spacegodzilla earlier, within the context of the Heisei series, between Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah up to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Toho was really focused on bringing back classic foes for Godzilla, at least most of the popular characters. With M.O.G.U.E.R.A on the other hand, not only was this character not from a Godzilla movie to begin with, but I do like the fact that Toho was willing to go out of the way to bring in such an obscure character for this movie, giving spotlight to one of their lesser known characters. And another aspect of M.O.G.U.E.R.A I did like is that it incorporated elements from one of the previous drafts of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, because if you paid attention to my review of that movie, in one of the drafts, Mechagodzilla was originally supposed to be a two-part combining robot, in which one half would transfer into a jet, while the other half would transfer into a tank. So I really do appreciate the filmmakers behind this movie bringing that concept from that script into this movie. Sure, it wasn't for Mechagodzilla, but I do like the fact that it was used for a different mech altogether, because when we do see M.O.G.U.E.R.A split into Land M.O.G.U.E.R.A and Star Falcon respectively, it does provide for a nice change in pace during the monster battle where you actually have two special weapons teaming up with Godzilla to help take down Spacegodzilla in some shape or form. Now, my biggest problem with M.O.G.U.E.R.A within the movie has to do with the fact that we never see it fight Godzilla himself. Because the reason why M.O.G.U.E.R.A was created within the context of this movie in the first place was to replace Mechagodzilla for the sole purpose of killing Godzilla. And we never see Godzilla and M.O.G.U.E.R.A fight each other. Sure, there is a moment where Yuki flies towards Godzilla with M.O.G.U.E.R.A and shoots some laser beams at Godzilla for 2 seconds before the other two co-pilots knock him out and take control of M.O.G.U.E.R.A to fly towards Spacegodzilla. But other than that, we never see the full potential of M.O.G.U.E.R.A in terms of how it would have competed against Godzilla himself. Would it have performed better than Mechagodzilla, or would this have been destroyed by Godzilla no problem? Because even though this version of M.O.G.U.E.R.A was created for the sole purpose of killing Godzilla, we see it fight Space Godzilla more times throughout the whole movie than Godzilla himself. So it's a really big disappointment that we didn't really get to see a full battle between Godzilla and M.O.G.U.E.R.A within this movie. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on revolves around the space battle between M.O.G.U.E.R.A and Space Godzilla. Because on the one hand, within the entire Godzilla franchise, this is so far the first and only giant monster battle to occur in outer space, which is a pretty neat thing to see. And before I go any further, I know what you're thinking. What about the first battle in Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, in which the Exilians bring Godzilla and Rodan to fight King Ghidorah on Planet X? For starters, that's another planet. What I'm talking about is outer space itself, not any planet, regardless if it's Earth or Planet X in general. Now, as for the problems that I have with the space battle, within the context of the movie, it's really pointless and dumb, because it just shows how weak and pathetic M.O.G.U.E.R.A is compared to Space Godzilla. And I feel this scene should have gone one of two ways. Either A, instead of having M.O.G.U.E.R.A fight Space Godzilla in outer space, I feel like the filmmakers could have gone one of two directions. Either A, replace this scene with M.O.G.U.E.R.A battling Godzilla, and have this be the only fight between M.O.G.U.E.R.A and Godzilla. Or B, have the space battle, but instead of having M.O.G.U.E.R.A fight Space Godzilla, replace M.O.G.U.E.R.A with Mothra and have her die as a result. Then I think it could have worked out for the better. Because at least with the Mothra battling Space Godzilla in space, at least that scenario would paint a picture of just how powerful Space Godzilla is compared to Mothra. And at least Mothra would play some kind of role within the movie. And another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is Miki Sugusa as a main character within this movie. As I stated in my Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 review, I mentioned that Miki Sugusa was slowly moving away from being a background character as seen in Godzilla vs. Biollante up to Godzilla Mothra the Battle for Earth, and while in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, she was starting to become more of a major support character. As for Miki Sugusa within the context of this movie, she's actually one of the main characters. So it is nice to see this recurring character go from being a background character to becoming a main character and actually having a role within the movie. Unfortunately, the writing for her character within this movie is not very good, because at the end of the previous movie, she stated that she would find a more peaceful way of dealing with Godzilla without resorting to violence, and within the context of this movie, G-Force, on top of developing M.O.G.U.E.R.A to kill him, they also have the idea of Operation T, which allows Miki Sugusa to mind control Godzilla, which is a more peaceful way of dealing with Godzilla as opposed to using M.O.G.U.E.R.A to kill him. Yet Miki Sugusa is not on board with this idea at all. Now sure, she does make the argument that she's against the idea of mind controlling Godzilla, since Godzilla himself is a sentient being and all sentient life forms should live their own life. Yet the way she goes about it, if I had to describe Miki Sugusa in regards to her writing in this particular movie, she comes off as a Tumblr activist from the 2010s, in that sense where she complains about everything, from most of the male casted characters who are gung-ho about killing Godzilla, saying men are stupid because the only thing they want is violence, even though in some of the past movies, such as Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, there have been some female characters who have joined the fight against Godzilla, ranging from the likes of Emmy, who piloted Mecha King Ghidorah, and that one unnamed female co-pilot in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, which I find to be really hilarious because during the climax of that movie, not only was that unnamed female co-pilot there, but so was Miki Sugusa. So pointing the finger at men exclusively just makes no sense, given that she herself, along with several other female characters, have joined the fight against Godzilla before, making her a hypocrite in this one instance. Then of course you have the one plot thread revolved around her and the Mothra fairies, which I will talk about later, but her relation with one of the other plot threads, that being the Yakuza plot, also bugs the hell out of me, because between Godzilla vs. Biollante up to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, it's established that she has a telepathic connection connection with Godzilla, and that her only abilities up to this point have been that, telepathic. Yet, during the Yakuza subplot, which, again, I'll talk about later, there's this moment where she's strapped to a table, and one of the Yakuza goons is using her as a shield to hide behind, and then, out of nowhere, it's shown that she has the ability of telekinesis, the ability to lift objects. And this is the first and only time she's ever done this. Sure, after the Yakuza subplot is over, it's established that, yeah, I never really tried the idea before. Yet, between Godzilla vs. Biollante up to this point, she's never mentioned having that ability whatsoever. And this is the only time she does it too, which really bugs me. Another aspect I have mixed feelings on are the special effects themselves, because on the one hand, I think a lot of the landscapes and cityscapes look great, and the particle effects for all of the monsters' atomic rays or laser beam focused weapons look neat as well. And that's as far as I can say about the special effects, because the other half of the special effects are not as well handled, because there are several points in time where there are a lot of chroma key green screen effects that look really awful, and some practical effects that I am just completely baffled by in some shots. The one that sticks out to me the most is sometime before Spacegodzilla fights Godzilla himself, is when you have Yuki chasing after Godzilla, and there's this moment where we have a bird's eye view looking down at Yuki, and we see the silhouette of Godzilla moving from the right side of the screen to the left, and we see Godzilla's silhouette, and I don't know what's going on here, but the combination of the movement and the silhouette looks unnatural, because it just looks like someone's pulling a bad model of Godzilla across the screen, and that silhouette of Godzilla doesn't have dorsal fins. Then, of course, you have the space battle, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and even though we see a lot of special effects between the puppets used for Spacegodzilla and M.O.G.E.R.A, along with the landscape of them battling an asteroid belt, if you notice in the background, it's just completely black, which is weird because it's space, and normally when you think of space, you think of not just a black background, but also see stars and galaxies and all that stuff. Now, granted, from what I understood, another Toho movie called Yamato Takeru, or as it was called here in the United States, Orochi the Eight-Headed Dragon, was another movie produced by Toho that the studio put a lot of money towards, but it ended up flopping at the box office. And because Toho was afraid Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla was gonna flop at the box office, they cut the budget to the movie, which is why the special effects were so wonky at points throughout the movie. I mean, do I even need to point out the infamous scene of Godzilla swimming and you see his tail literally snap in half? And despite the numerous problems I have with the special effects in this movie, at least they're of the quality of being so bad they're good. So there is entertainment value to be had with the special effects in this movie. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, of all the installments of the Heisei era of the Godzilla franchise are concerned, Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla has the worst soundtrack. Sure, some of the other installments that came out before this movie, I thought had a rather mixed bag, where some of the music was forgettable while other soundtracks were really well composed and worked well for the movie. The soundtrack to this particular movie is not good. For starters, way before the movie went into production, Akira Ifukube was originally supposed to be the composer for this movie, but during the production of it, Akira Ifukube read the script and refused to be the composer for this movie because when he read the script, it reminded him too much of a teen idol film. So, a new composer was brought in, that being Takayuki Hattori, if I'm pronouncing his name right, who's the same composer that did the soundtracks to all the Slayers anime movies and a soundtrack to a anime TV series called Battle Athletes. And as far as the soundtrack is concerned for this movie, it's not very good. For the simple reason that it tries way too hard to emulate Akira Ifukube's compositions instead of doing their own thing. Because as the actual music stands, it comes off more as a discount Akira Ifukube's soundtrack. Now, another problem that I have with the movie, there are several points in time where the movie pinballs certain sequences, And if you're wondering what the term pinball means in movie terms, when you watch a movie, watching a movie should be like reading a book, because no matter what's going on screen, there's a certain flow to the movie. All the characters, no matter what they're doing, should start on the left side of the screen, move towards the right. And that's the way the whole movie should go. Doesn't matter what the character's doing, everything has to have a flow going from left to right. Pinball is literally an occurrence where you might have one sequence in which characters go from the left to right side of the screen, but then the next edit later, you have the same characters going from the right side to the left side, and then one edit later, you literally have the same characters going from the left side to the right side of the screen. And here's the thing, you're not supposed to do that because it not only disrupts the flow, but it also makes the scene in question hard to follow from an editing point of view. An example I'm thinking of off the top of my head is the point where sometime before Spacegodzilla arrives to confront Godzilla for the first time, you literally have Godzilla walking along the island and you have Yuki going after him. And this is basically where I noticed the pinball effect taking place the most within the context of the movie. And another thing I disliked about the movie are the human characters, because with the exception of Yuki, I just think all the human characters in this movie are really forgettable. Sure, you got Miki Sugusa, who's memorable too, but not for the right reasons, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Another problem that I have with the movie, well, before I even go any further, if you saw my review for Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, one of the biggest praises I give that movie was it took pre-existing plot points from other installments of the Heisei era and used them to its advantage. Giving a good example of how to use pre-existing continuity, with Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla on the other hand, it does the exact same thing of taking pre-existing plot points from other installments of the Heisei era, but instead of using them to its advantage, it just causes problems for this movie. The big one being the origin to Spacegodzilla himself. Because in the original Godzilla vs. Astrogodzilla draft of the movie, Astrogodzilla's origin was more simplified, whereas Spacegodzilla's origin in this movie has some elements, but it's made more ambiguous. But it still kind of results in the same type of problem. And before I go any further, normally anytime a new monster is introduced within the context of a Godzilla movie, they either have a very simplified origin of either being a prehistoric creature that was awakened to some capacity, they're a mutation, or they're from space. And while Spacegodzilla definitely fills the latter, the rest of his origin is really elaborate, because within the context of the story, there's not one but two possibilities behind his creation. Now, the actual origin of having Godzilla's DNA end up in space, going through a black hole, coming out of a white hole, and resulting crystal organisms getting exposed to dying stars is already a origin that I think would give people a brain aneurysm. The cast of characters give not one, but two different possibilities of how Godzilla's DNA ended up in space. One possibility being that Mothra may have brought some of his cells into space after her battle with Godzilla in Godzilla Mothra: The Battle for Earth by complete accident, or another suggestion that really doesn't make sense, that was also a part of the Astrogodzilla draft, is that Biollante's spores flew into space and some of her G cells were responsible for the creation of Spacegodzilla. The problem with the possibility that Biollante's spores were responsible for Spacegodzilla's creation is that this movie occurs a couple movies after Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, in which Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was the one Godzilla movie that had a time-traveling plot in which the Futurians went back in time with the sole mission of getting rid of Godzilla and replacing him with King Ghidorah in order to destroy Japan, meaning that Biollante shouldn't exist. Yet this movie occurs sometime after Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and you have a character or two that remember who Biollante is, which shouldn't be possible. Then again, there were certain characters in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah who didn't take part in the time-traveling mission that were able to remember who and what Godzilla was in that movie, showing how inconsistent the continuity is within the Heisei era of the Godzilla franchise. But here's the strange aspect of Spacegodzilla's origin. Between the two suggestions, both kinda make sense, because at least with the explanation behind Mothra, that would make sense because the events of Godzilla Mothra: The Battle for Earth occur after Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. But when you look at Spacegodzilla as a character, you notice that there's a lot more similarities between him and Biollante, given that both of them spawned from the same G cells as Godzilla. Both can change form to a degree, with Biollante going back and forth between her organic form and the flying spore form, and Spacegodzilla going back and forth between his flying form and his land form. Both Biollante and Spacegodzilla have tusks at the end of their snout, and during Spacegodzilla's final moments before finally dying, we see what look like spores that look very similar to Biollante spores drifting towards space itself. But again, because of the time traveling shenanigans that occurred in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Biollante shouldn't exist, even though it's the one explanation that makes more sense to some capacity. And this leads into another problem I have with the way this movie utilizes pre-existing continuity, because it both acknowledges and ignores pre-existing continuity. And if you're already confused by that statement, I'm going to explain the best I can, because on top of having certain characters within this movie remembering who and what Biollante is, that means that when this movie was in production, the filmmakers either forgot about the time travel plot of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, or chose to ignore it, allowing the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante to remain post Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Yet, within the context of this movie, it's established that MOGERA was salvaged from the remains of Super Mechagodzilla from the movie prior to this one. And Super Mechagodzilla was already salvaged through the remains of Mecha King Ghidorah from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, which is impossible, because you can't have one movie acknowledge and ignore certain aspects that occurred in several other movies that occurred before this one. And perhaps for my biggest problem with the movie is the plot, because Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla on pen and paper is about Godzilla teaming up with a giant robot to battle a space clone of Godzilla himself. And on pen and paper, this sounds like a very simple premise, but the way in which the movie executes said premise is anything but simple, because the movie, in regards to its plot, is just a complete mess. I mean, I don't even know where to begin, because there's just so much wrong with it. I guess a good starting point is the plot itself, for the simple reason that on top of having Godzilla battling Spacegodzilla, there's a lot of, I don't want to say subplots, but plot threads that occur throughout the entire movie. Everything from Spacegodzilla arriving towards Earth, having G-Force send M.O.G.U.E.R.A to confront Spacegodzilla. Then you got another subplot revolved around a group of G-Force members trying to execute Operation T against Godzilla on Birth Island. Then you have another plot thread revolved around Miki Sugusa communicating with the two Mothra fairies in regards to Spacegodzilla, along with another plot thread revolved around Yuki's relationship with Colonel Gondo from Godzilla vs. Biollante, and the last plot thread being the Yakuza subplot. This movie just has way too much going on, and because this movie has too many plot threads going on, this affects the pacing of the movie, because the movie itself is only an hour and 46 minutes in length, yet the movie feels a lot longer than it should have. And according to IMDb, apparently the original cut of Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla ran around 2.5 hours long. However, Toho wanted the movie to have the same runtime as some of the other Heisei Godzilla movies, so they imposed many cuts throughout the entire movie, which probably would have fleshed out a lot of these plot threads, which would explain why Godzilla vs. Spacegodzilla's plot is as messy as it is. And of the many plot threads that occur throughout this movie, there are two that I have really big problems with, starting with the infamous Yakuza subplot. Because originally, I wanted to talk about this Yakuza subplot in the aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings on, but I ultimately had more problems with the Yakuza subplot than anything else, because on pen and paper, having a Godzilla movie that incorporates the Yakuza, I think would make for a great idea, because this is the first movie to include the Yakuza. Sure, we've had a crime element in some of the older Godzilla movies, but nothing directly tying it to the Yakuza themselves. But the problem with the Yakuza subplot in this movie is there's no build up to it. It literally comes straight out of nowhere and takes up 9 minutes and 14 seconds of the movie. And not only that, the Yakuza literally have nothing to do with the actual movie itself. Because the reason why the Futurians worked as good human villains in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is that they're the ones that have the most influence throughout the entire movie, and they have a connection with the monster villain of that movie, with King Ghidorah being their puppet, until King Ghidorah becomes Mecha King Ghidorah during its climax. But even then, the Futurians still had influence over the entire movie in some capacity. But the Yakuza subplot in this movie movie, quite literally, has nothing to do with anything. It's not connected with Space Godzilla, and while one of the members of the Yakuza was involved with Operation T, ultimately amounts to nothing. That's literally 9 minutes and 14 seconds of the movie that could have been removed. Then you have the other plot thread revolved around Mikisugusa and the Mothra fairies, because it's just another plot thread that didn't need to occur. But I understand why it's in the movie, because as I mentioned earlier, Mothra was originally supposed to be in this movie at some point. But due to Toho limiting the budget to this movie, Mothra only makes that cameo appearance. And even then, I still think the plot threads revolved around the Mothra fairies could have been cut out of the movie. And I think the stupidest aspect in relation to the Mothra fairies is the way it concludes. Because the way it begins, you literally have the two Mothra fairies talking to Mikisugusa, warning her about Space Godzilla. Then when Space Godzilla is defeated, they show up again saying, "Thank you, Mikisugusa, for saving Godzilla and the Earth." Here's my problem with that line of dialogue. Mikisugusa did absolutely nothing. Seriously, she shows up to the final battle wearing some funny looking jacket, watches the battle, and that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm just confused as to why they're saying thank you to her, because they really shouldn't, because she did nothing. If anything, Godzilla, Yuki, along with the other two pilots of MOGERA, did more to save the Earth than Mikisugusa. Now, a way I think the filmmakers could have included Mikisugusa within the context of the final battle, I think should have gone something along the lines of this, where maybe there's a point where Godzilla and MOGERA are both down, and Space Godzilla's about to finish them off. You have Mikisugusa, because she has that psychic connection with Godzilla, maybe tries to tap into Space Godzilla, since he's got genetic material related to Godzilla, taps into his mind just enough to distract him, allowing both Godzilla and MOGERA to gain the upper hand on Space Godzilla. That, I think, would have worked. As this plot thread is concerned, I'm starting to learn that any Heisei installment of the Godzilla franchise that includes Mothra into the mix is a good sign that the movie is not very good. And another problem I have with the movie, remember how I stated earlier that Toho cut a lot of material out of this movie to make the runtime an hour and 40-ish minutes? I'm confused as to why there's some things they took out and some things they kept in. Because when Godzilla first appears in this movie, he rises up from the ocean, heading towards the beach of Birth Island. And no joke, this sequence of Godzilla going from the ocean to the beach takes him 4 minutes and 27 seconds. Okay, first off, why does the scene go on for that long? I feel like you could have cut out 3 minutes of Godzilla arriving towards the beach to make it shorter. The reason why I bring this up, after Godzilla's first battle with Space Godzilla that results in Little Godzilla getting imprisoned by Space Godzilla, the way the scene plays out, Space Godzilla leaves, Godzilla begins to chase after him, and that's it. Yet, according to some sources, apparently there is a deleted scene in which we see Godzilla inspecting the crystal prison that's holding Little Godzilla. I'm not entirely sure why this scene didn't make it into the final product, because I feel like it's really important for the story and Godzilla's character. Because one, it would give Godzilla proper motivation to go after Space Godzilla, and second, it would have added more character to Godzilla himself, showcasing that he is indeed a caring father that will do anything to rescue his son. As the current movie sits, it presents him as being very cold and tired, and not caring of his son, which is unfortunate because, as I mentioned in my previous review, Godzilla's ongoing story arc within the Heisei series is him trying to reconnect with another member of his species, and Baby Godzilla fills that role. So why this scene didn't make the final cut, yet having several minutes of Godzilla walking towards the beach was included, is beyond me. Honestly, there's several other plot points that I could bring up that I have problems with, but I think you get the point. So for my final verdict of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, there are two ways I can summarize this movie. The first being, how is it as an installment of the Heisei era? And the second being, just as an installment of the Godzilla franchise in general. Starting with how Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla stands as an installment of the Heisei era. As I stated earlier, when I grew up watching this movie, I too was a part of that group of Godzilla fans that considered Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla to be the worst installment of the Heisei era. But upon watching it now, while I still consider it to be a bad installment of the Heisei era, I don't think it's the worst installment. If anything, I actually think 1992's Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth is the worst installment of the Heisei era, followed by Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Godzilla. But the really big question is, how does Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla stand as an installment within the entire Godzilla franchise? While I don't think it's the worst installment of the Godzilla franchise, I definitely do consider it to be bottom 10 worst Godzilla movies in general. But if I had to compare this to another Godzilla movie, I to put this in the same ballpark as Godzilla vs. Gigan in that sense of, I love the new edition of Space Godzilla, I just did not like the story nor characters surrounding it because of how poorly handled they are. And because of that, I think Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla is an installment of not just the Heisei era of the Godzilla franchise, but as an installment of the Godzilla franchise that you can skip unless if you're in the right state of mind to riff on the movie in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of way. But overall, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla is a 40th anniversary milestone movie that comes off as filler in the grand scheme of things. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla? The movie has slightly better reception than I anticipated. But anywho, for my final rating of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, I give it a 2 out of 5. So, would you like to see Space Godzilla return in a future installment of the Godzilla franchise? And see you later.